Anyway, welcome back, everybody. I know this has been an intense couple of days, and I certainly find that just processing all the information, as I said, even when I know most of it or all of it, or I should know all of it, I still find by the end of the time, at least sort of my brain feels full. But the goal for this segment is mostly to be interactive with a few slides, but really to sort of talk about how we put it all together. And then to work through, my guess is that a few of you have projects that you're mulling over, where perhaps the way you're thinking about it or what might be possible is changing. So again, part of what we're going to do today is in this segment is to sort of pull together all of those themes and then work through a problem or two or get some ideas. And I'm always grateful. Steph is going to join me usually in this. I'm hoping you're up for that today still. And others who might be available from ResDAC. I don't know who else is still on. So again, there's time for questions, use chat, the usual stuff, you all know this. So in summary, Medicare data are very powerful and they're very complex. And so the challenge is balancing the two. The things that you've got to remember, first of all, the variables need to be created. And so when you think of it, so it takes time to stop and say, well, how can I do this? Here's what I want. I want to know if somebody had a stroke in March 2016, or more directly for most of us, I want to know if somebody had a stroke, and if they did, what was the date of that stroke? And that's a very legitimate thing to want to know. But what we then have to do is say, well, how would it happen? How would we identify somebody with a stroke? How would we make sure, as we were talking about earlier today, that it was a stroke and not a rule out stroke, or not a TIA, or not something else? How do we figure that out? And what is the risk we take between sensitivity and specificity, between identifying too many strokes and not enough? As you learned with working with Sammy, the data structure is complex. These are not rectangular files. There are multiple one-to-many relationships to manage. And that is not easy. It's been interesting. Even the data science people that I talk to, when they really start getting their head around this structure, they sort of go like, wait a minute, I've never had to deal with anything of this level. So a lot of it has to do with being patient, I believe, and realizing that sometimes you need to do iterations. You can't just do one program and have everything work. The files are annual. And that's just another level that makes things tricky. So when you order the data, you order it a year at a time. But in fact, most of our follow-up windows are not within a single calendar year. If we want to do a one-year follow-up, it means we're going to have to get a couple of years worth of data. And if we're going to have a partial look back so we can get pre-event comorbidities, we might be working with 3 years worth of data to work with 1 year worth of cases. So some of that is to remember that when you design your study, and to think about, well, what exactly do I need to do what I need? And which, again, is sort of a thought process. But then the other thing is it's a budgeting process. But it also is a programming process, because all of a sudden, if you remember that carrier file, you get the price per year when you figure out what you can afford, and you have to think about how much data space, but in fact, what you really need is going to maybe be even bigger than that. The other piece is that CMS takes data release very seriously. And so there are a couple of rules that they will make sure are followed when this says when releasing data, I guess to be completely accurate, when deciding whether to release data. So one of the questions is minimum data necessary. That's a HIPAA rule. So in other words, we have to request the minimum data necessary. So if you're arguing that you need 100% of the Medicare population, they're going to look at that and ask whether you actually have made a scientific choice, or whether there's an alternate way for you to do the study with less data. Or you may say, I need every claim type, and CMS might look at it and say, but your only outcome is hospitalization. I don't understand why you need the home health or the durable medical equipment file. None of your aims, nothing that you are asking has anything to do with it. So it's going to be very important that as you think about your study, that you're able to articulate it and explain the vision between what you want to do, what you are asking to do, and what you are allowed to do. The other piece with CMS is that they will not fill requests where the study can't be completed. So they will say, wait a minute, you say you want to look at whether tobacco use is associated with clean surgical margins. It's an important question, but the data, the file doesn't have any information on surgical margins. It does have information on surgeries, and it doesn't have a lot of information on tobacco use. So how exactly are you going to do this study? And how can we be sure that if we release the data for you to do the work, that you actually could complete the study? The other piece, and this is again one of those where I'm reluctant to admit it, but I have made this mistake personally, and I've been held accountable to this, which is if you don't ask for something and you figure out later on that you made a mistake, then you're going to have to pay for a second release. So I had it where I was doing something and I missed a whole section of codes. I was feeling pressure to get something done by a certain date. I hadn't looked at the code book carefully, and I missed a chunk of codes and ended up having to do the project without it. I did some smoke and mirrors and argued it didn't really matter. But the reality was I made a mistake. I didn't ask for everything I needed. The data would have to be rerun, and CMS's comment was, it wasn't our mistake. It was your mistake, and your mistake you pay for, our mistake we pay for. So do take the time to be patient, to double check, to triple check. And as I said earlier, and I really do mean this, if you've used ICD-9 data, you've used ICD-10, and just as a sort of, I spent a summer doing ICD-9 coding in grad school, so I did get very fluent with the ICD-9 codes, I have to admit. But I do think ICD-9 codes, at least to me, are more visually obvious than ICD-10. So so my biggest fear with ICD-10 is I think it's much easier to make a mistake because they're not in sequence in quite the same way as we described yesterday. So just double, triple, quadruple check for the codes. But there are things that we can only do with Medicare data, and they're important things. The first work that's been done, it's now almost standard around geography and quality of care, geography and care access. That was only possible because national data existed. The first time this was done was with Medicare data, and the best times it is done was with Medicare data. These questions, the question that I personally ask routinely, which is it the people or is it where they are treated, is not possible to do without large data sets like this. A lot of our understanding of racial variation and our ability to simultaneously model racial variation is with Medicare data. It's really challenging with primary data collection. Understanding people's health over time, being able to actually measure it or measure healthcare use, and understanding the association between payment and other policies and healthcare use. These are the data to use. So yes, it is hard. Yes, you need to do some programming. Yes, you need to spend a lot of time thinking, which is hard sometimes when you feel pressure to do, but the pain is worth it. So don't let the complexity scare you away, but don't ignore the complexity. So are the claims right for you? This is a serious question. And I will again say that although I use Medicare claims for a lot of my research, I do not use it for all of my research. And that's because they are not always the right question. So the first question you should be asking is does your target population, is it Medicare covered? So do they fall under the age, end-stage renal disease, Social Security Administration defined disability? So as an example, is the condition you want to study, is it in fact a condition that these populations have? Is it a procedure that is commonly used by these populations? A cancer example is cervical cancer. I'm very interested in studying cervical cancer, but the mean age of cervical cancer diagnosis is in the 40s, and yet Medicare population coverage, so age, is in the 60s. And what I realized is that if I started studying cervical cancer using Medicare, and even cervical cancer screening, I would only pick up unusual cases. I wouldn't pick up the typical case. And so when those studies, we've had to find other data sources to understand the population base of it. So that's just sort of an example where you really do want to think about whether, in terms of generalizability, the population and the condition you want to study, whether Medicare is the right program. The next question is whether you can identify your population using information in Medicare claims and enrollment data. And again, a couple of examples I will give you. One is tobacco use. Smoking is a massive risk factor. When we even look at things like the new lung cancer screening policy and how many people get it and whether there's any disparity, one of the requirements for lung cancer screening and being eligible for it is a smoking history. But in fact, we don't have smoking history in the Medicare enrollment and claims data. Income, job history are things that this might be the right population, but we really have to ask ourselves very seriously, can we do this? Can you identify, as Nate asked, your key outcome and explanatory variables, your key adjusting variables? And then finally, can you afford Medicare data? And honestly, one more to add in is getting these data takes time, and using these data take time. So from time to time, occasionally people will call me in my ResDAC role. They would call me up and say, look, I need this because the abstracts are due next week. I just say, no, like you can't get from receiving data to having a poster ready for a meeting in a week. So does your time frame work? Does your budget work? And are they the right data for you scientifically? These are serious questions. And I will tell you personally, I've not always answered yes. So it's okay to answer no. It's okay to decide this wasn't quite right, but I'm going to keep these in my hip pocket. I'm going to remember them because another questions would be the right question. Are you prepared for the complexity of Medicare coding? And again, we've talked about things that are important. One of them is coding changes, reporting requirements, payment changes. These are interesting. I found myself, again, as I told you, my background's epidemiology. And I used to always say, and Peter is a super good friend of mine, I used to say, I'm not an economist. And I would still say that, and Peter would happily agree. But one of the things I've learned is I have to understand payment because payment rules are affecting the epidemiology. They're affecting what I see and how it happens and when it happens. And so some of these things, you don't need to have it to be your focus to ignore it. And coding changes are one of the ones that I think cause us the most trouble because they're often hard to find. There's no listing. You will never, people say they do it, but rarely with enough detail. Will say, well, go to this website and we'll tell you every policy change or coding change that happened to the Medicare in a calendar year. I would love it if somebody did that. But at present, I don't know. And then remember that ICD-10 codes are organized differently than ICD-9. So if you were interested in the impact, and I think this is the reason that very few people have studied the impact of the ICD-9 to ICD-10 transition, is because it is so painful to recode these things. The codes are so different. Some codes have been replaced, some codes have been expanded, some codes have been contracted. So, but if you span that period, that adjustment period, you are going to have to be prepared to handle it. And it's not going to be, in my mind, it's not going to be easy, but there are certainly ways of asking questions to help you manage it. So when you request CMS data, you're going to have to submit a formal data request. And the purpose of the data request is to do a couple of things. Part of the request is to get permission from CMS to ensure that the data meet minimum data necessary, but can meet study goals, that the study goals are consistent with CMS policy. And the other piece of it is to translate what you need into a data request. So you're simultaneously meeting a couple of different audiences. For the data request, you're talking to analysts who are going to be doing an extract out of these incredibly complex databases. And you need to let them know exactly what to do because they will follow your directions. And so it means we're going to have to stop and think, what exactly am I going to tell them to do? The other thing you need to do, though, is help CMS with their compliance obligations by making sure they understand what it is you're doing and how it fits in with HIPAA with all of the data requests. So it's a mix of things, but that's what the request process is. ResDAC will help you with that, and that's important, but you do have to know that it can be frustrating, especially if you're like I am, where I have a vision in my mind of what I want to do, and I know what I want, and I know it's right, and somehow these people are asking these questions that aren't exactly how I was thinking about it, and I have to stop and answer their questions and think about all those details that I didn't really want to do. So when you select data, remember that you can use a range of criteria for selecting your cohorts. You could ask for a percentage of beneficiaries. I want a 5% random sample. I want to understand the population. In some files, you can get 100%. You could say, I want 100% hospice file and 100% master Benny summary file, so I can understand hospice use as a function of deaths. You could get 100%. Because if there's a reason to do it. You can select based on the presence of a diagnosis, receipt of a procedure, or a chronic condition. You can ask for geography. I want everybody who lives in the state of Florida in 2020, 2021, and 2022. So you can do a geographic-based selection, or I want to look for everybody that is treated by a provider in a comprehensive cancer center or in a teaching hospital. You can select based on demographics, and you can link to a known cohort. So you can say, I've got a cohort of people that I have seen in my clinic, and I want their claims. So again, you've got a range of ways you can pick the people you have. And one of the things that they're going to do at CMS when they do the review is they're going to ask whether your selection matches what you say the study is about. And that will cut both ways. So if you say, well, I only want people in the state of Florida, and you're talking about a national study, they're going to question it. But more likely, if your whole project is about Florida and you request national data, they're going to kick it back. And they're going to say, we don't see why national data is going to help you do this, when in fact, you only want to generalize to one state. So do be ready for those questions and think about them and have answers. And if you want to do something and you can't figure out how exactly to do it, be really candid with ResDAC, with the ResDAC TA who you work with, and say, well, here's what I really want to do. This is what I'm trying to figure out, because we'll help you sort it out, and we'll help you come up with a strategy that will get you what you want, because that's our goal too. Our goal is for you to succeed and get your data. So when you create a cohort, you're going to have to stop and think about things, which is in some cases whether the way you described it, because again, when you come up with your description, sometimes you're like, well, I didn't mean it that way. This was one really early in my career. I said I wanted everybody who was continuously in the state of Florida for a 2-year period. And I did that, and that made total sense, and that's what I meant. But what I didn't do is I didn't say 2 years or until death. Okay, so what it meant is once people die, they're no longer, from CMS's perspective, residents. And so I deleted all of my outcomes. This happened again. There was another example today of like, well, if you require a year's survival, then one of the things you're doing is you're selecting out some of your outcomes. Likewise, by using a continuous 2 years, I got no new enrollees. So at the end of my study, I had an older than average, healthier than average population, because I got rid of all my new enrollees, and I got rid of all of the people who were dead. And the people who were left were a non-random subset of the people I really intended to see. So really stop and think what you need. And if you can't figure out how to say it, you can say, well, here's what I really want. And again, make sure that what you really want and what you ask for are the same thing. My advice, and again, this is just me, is don't be afraid of the word and so you don't have to select using one thing only. You can use a range of things. So I personally can be very wary of selecting cases based on the CCW conditions only. And that's because the algorithms are a funny mix. They're simultaneous. In some cases, they're too broad. The cohorts are going to be too big. Like, oh, well, it returned a lot of people I don't need. And in other cases, in other situations, they might be too restrictive, and there might be a code or a couple of codes that you think are really important that aren't included there. So in some ways, it can mismatch. It can be close, but especially if you consider all of this work, you need to do the legwork and figure out whether the CCW flag does what you want, and think carefully about, how would it handle, and just go through the thought exercise of like, what would happen to a person who had this pattern? Would I get them? Would I not get them? And try to make sure that the people you get and the people you want are the same. So there are some tools that can help you. One is a CCW study size estimator. This will let you do simple searches on Medicare enrollment, diagnosis, procedure codes. Now, honestly, most of our sample size adjustments are quite complex, but what this does help you do, which can be super important, is it does help you get an idea. Like if there's a procedure you want to study and you're like, well, let me just confirm how many cases there were. And you're like, oh, there were 500 cases in the year who got this one procedure. And I know I'm going to get some loss due to Part D and maybe some disenrollment and other random stuff. Then what it tells me is that I need to think very carefully, like, do I really believe this is a procedure that only 500, or a diagnosis that only 500 people had, or is it possible I'm missing them? And an example of what that might be, years ago, we were looking at a procedure where people who have have cancer in one breast are getting the other breast removed as well. And so when I was looking at coding, I assumed that would be coded as a bilateral mastectomy. The technical term for surgeons is a contralateral prophylactic mastectomy, but I said bilateral, 2 mastectomies. But it turns out it's rarely coded as a bilateral mastectomy, even though there's a procedure code for it. It's most often coded as 2 unilateral mastectomies. And the surgeons would tell me that the procedure is different for the breast that has the cancer and the one that doesn't. The problem is, if I'd asked for the wrong thing, I wouldn't have gotten it. One way we figured out to talk to the surgeons is we used the sample size estimator, and we're like, wait a minute, there aren't that many of these being done. So we had 2 bits of information and they weren't matching. The sample size estimator helped me figure out way up front that I was not getting as many of these as other sources, cancer registries were pointing to. And that helped me catch that there was a coding error, that I was not using the right codes. And I was able to catch it before I actually ordered data. So that's an example where the sample size estimator can help you figure out if what you're thinking is on par with what's probably going on. And as we said earlier today, the claims processing manual, I know it sounds nuts. And the first time somebody told me to read it, I'm like, I don't need that just sounds so, I don't know, bureaucratic. It's incredibly useful. I usually keep them bookmarked and up. I used to keep them on, just practically open. They used to be in paper, so they would just sit on my desk. But use the claim processing manual. It can give you ideas about how things actually show up. And there are going to be things that you didn't think you could find that you can. There can be things that the plain language doesn't match how people are told to do it. But it is super useful, and I encourage you to look them up and keep them handy. Now, as we keep saying, don't forget to carefully consider how you will find your population, how you will define events, and how you will define your adjusting variables. These are the key to all of this. And what I would say is, just real quick, you're going to have to do it eventually. If you don't do, you're going to have to figure it out in order to do your study. So you might as well do it before you order the data, so you can make sure you do it right. So that's my doing the thinking up front. So with that, just a quick poll. What sort of data do you think you will want for either your first project or your next project? Why don't we give it just a couple more seconds? So, okay, I don't know if you can all see this. So first of all, this is interesting, and this is a little bit of a shift from sometimes when we teach it. So a very small percentage of you think you're just going to want a full population sample. This is becoming more and more common. First of all, a clinical or a diagnostic sample, and a linkage with other data. With the linkage, those are one of the things to consider there, and do keep in mind, is the quality of your identifiers. So the better the quality of the identifiers, the easier and the more successful the linkage will be. And then for the others, hopefully this experience will give you some ideas about what to do, or perhaps what is possible. So I'm going to just keep going. So just remember some final thoughts. And then what we're going to do is we'll actually turn off the slides and just do a Q&A period. Double check everything. As Steph said, look at a few records, sort of like the exercise we've been doing, and confirm the world is acting the way you expect. I sometimes will also take sort of what I consider things to be off diagonal. I don't expect to see A and B. And so I will look at cases that aren't conforming to my expectations to try to figure out why not. In some cases, like, oh, there's a code that they all have that I missed. In other cases, it could be something else, like it just really isn't working. And then the other piece, and this is something that you will have to do, is these are massive files. I'm sure there's a term for it, but basically any data or many studies you do will be overpowered. And so we will often have to talk about relative impact rather than statistical significance, or we'll have to do other things to avoid going down a trap, which with editors can be painful, of saying, well, yes, it's statistically significant, but we don't think it's important. So we have to do things to make it so that we don't find things that are statistically significant. You know, for every year older you are, your chances go up. When somebody is in their 90s, you may say, you know what, a year doesn't matter. It's not a relevant period of age or whatever. So just remember that the power and the sample size can be both a blessing and a curse.